Okay, I think we'll just get started then. So, hello everybody, and thank you so much for tuning into our last interview of the month. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce our surprise guest, the former president, Mr. J.G. Zuma. Thank you so much, Dad, for agreeing to be the guest today.
Thanks for to be here.
Thank you. And then, before each interview, I always have to give a quick disclaimer. Yes, so the comments will be left on throughout the interview, but if they get too distracting and stuff, then I'd have to switch them off. And then if you have any further questions during the interview, feel free to send them through the chat, or you can send them through the question thing that should be at the bottom of your screen. It's on the side of my screen at the moment, but yes. So without further ado, let's get started. So, Dad, could you please give us a brief introduction about who you are and what you've done? Just a brief one.
Well, I am Jacob Zuma, the man who started to be conscious politically at my young age. I was influenced in the first instance through stories, particularly by two old people. It was a woman, a loved one, and a Bengu, who were teenagers during the Bambata Rebellion, who were also captured by the British as they were defeating the rebellion or suppressing the rebellion. So they used to give stories which were stories that they experienced. And that is what was the first political understanding of what is happening. And secondly, influenced by my elder brother, the firstborn of my father, who was a soldier in the Last World War, but also was a member of the African National Congress, as well as became the member of, a trade unionist who spoke very highly of the ANC and the workers. He gave me a lot of influence. And of course, because my mother was working as a domestic worker in Durban, I used to visit her at some point and saw ANC gatherings in Durban, and I was very much influenced by all of this. So at my young age, when I started working, I joined the ANC and also joined the trade union movement, and I lived that all the time. And of course later, when the ANC was burned, I was one of the activists underground, but also in the ANC Youth League as a trade unionist. I also joined MK shortly after it was established, but also I became the member of the South African Communist Party, and therefore this is what happened. In my early days, when I was between just 21 or 22, I was arrested, sentenced to 10 years, served my 10 years on Robben Island, came out of Robben Island, stayed in South Africa 1 and 11 months after Robben Island. Then I left the country for exile. I spent 14 and a half years in exile, and then came back, and that was part of the negotiations, the talk about talks, big negotiations up to there. And thereafter, when we're getting into the elections, and then forming the interim governments, etc., and national and provincial, I then had asked President Mandela to allow me to go to KZN, which was Natal then, to participate in an effort to end violence that was happening there. And I therefore ended up going to the province where I I became the chairperson of the region, Southern Natal region. When the regions were put together, all three, I then became the provincial chairperson of the ANC in the first, in the first 5-year period as well in government. And I was there. Then, of course, at the end of the first term, I came to national as a deputy president of the ANC. And thereafter I became the president, and thereafter I resigned. That's me. I shortened this very much.
Yes, that's indeed basically answered all the questions that I had for you today.
Okay.
But yes, I'll still ask them. Yes. So, as you know, I've been having these interviews throughout the course of this month. And this month, especially in the American context, it's called Black History Month. And it's so where they celebrate, Black history and stuff. So do you think that it's an important month to celebrate here, even though it is traditionally an American holiday? And if so, or if you don't think so, why would you say so?
Well, I think it is correct for all of us to celebrate or to observe this month as a month that really reminds us the position of Black people, not just in America or in South Africa, in the world. I know as I do that all Black people in the world are, in a sense, put in a secondary kind of position. As you know, if you talk about the stages of the world's development, you will appreciate that when the first terrible period came, which was called the slavery period, a very huge number of the Black people were made slaves. And they were taken out of their continent in the most brutal manner and made slaves. They went into Europe, United States of America, and other parts of the world to work to create the economies of those countries, not the economies of their own. In Africa, they were taken away, never came back, and they were taken away in a very brutal manner. And as you know, the slavery period took a long time until there was a struggle against slavery, and then finally it was abolished. But those people who had been taken from their places, the first generation, I'm sure they had almost died. And the young ones who were born, they did not even remember which is the country where I came from. And therefore that is the burden of a Black person in the world. And secondly, you recall that after the slavery, when people in Europe had come to us on the slave trade, as well as coming across our resources and everything, developed other ideas about Africa, which was the second time. They decided to come and take Africa without the agreement of the indigenous people. It was called colonialism. In other words, they colonized. In other words, if they came to an area, they say this was an area either by Britain will occupy this, or France this, or Germany this. These were called their colonies. So they colonized us. In other words, made us their subjects. They were not like saying, let us have a relationship. They came and put their flags and declared their countries on our countries, and then took everything, and kept on taking everything to their countries. Were colonized for a long time, until Africans, particularly after the Second World War, were in, there was a very big cry that there must be decolonization of Africa. And then we also began to wage struggles against colonization. And then it was another kind of period. And I think we, particularly the Africans, although in other countries there were colonized places, but they were in particular in the Far East, etc. But Africa became very unique because it is quite a unique continent. And we fought for our national freedom because our nationhood was taken away. We were called subjects of the imperialist countries that were done as that thing. Even the decolonization was very skewed, not correct. They never left to say remain in your countries, then do what you want. They actually moved in a system where they would say we are giving you self-government for a particular period to check whether you can run countries and then declare full independence. But independence was not full because it was only political, not economic. So in terms of our being put down the ladder on the economic side of things continues up to this day. And therefore the burden of a black person remains, whether you like it or not. Economically, we are still very low. Perhaps not slaves, perhaps not colonial people, because we can now vote, whatever, but something closer to that we still have that problem. But of course there are a few blacks who have emerged, but too little to talk about it. The greater majority still is in problems. If you talk about us here in South Africa, still what to call it, only 13% we use, and is now full because the land does not grow. But the rest of the land is empty. And that's a burden of a black person. We never choose to be where we are. We're pushed into where we are. Nobody's saying now there's freedom, come back to your area. So the burden of a black person is big. That is why if we observe and remember the black man, we as Africans, we ought to be very active on that one because we need to conscientize ourselves that it is not yet uhuru, it's not yet freedom. We do need to have full freedom. If we talk about us in this country, what is it that makes you to say you have economy? You must have the land, firstly. And secondly, you must participate in the economy of the country. And the economy of the country is run by finances. There is no black bank. There is no people who are black who are running huge sums of money. That's a problem we are faced with. And therefore, the manner in which whether you call it democracy or decolonization or whatever, is still skewed. It's not yet correct.
Well, you see, that's reasoning for the Black History Month. I think that just sums up all of the meanings of why people choose to celebrate Black History Month. And thank you so much for that, yes. So, to sort of get to know you on a more personal level, do you mind describing your early life? So, before you got into politics, what was the day-to-day life of yours and how was your living situation back then?
Well, I was a young man in the rural areas. Mine was to do what all young people do. firstly, as a young person, you are at home. As you grow slightly, the bigger boys take you out there, begin to see how things are happening. And of course, you go through a school which we call head boy schooling, wherein you look after cattle. But you don't start in the cattle, you start looking after the baby goats, small goats, and then thereafter the baby cows who are there, and you learn how to milk, how to look after cattle so that they don't mess up the gardens and fields that people are doing. And then you grow. That's how you grow. You are taught how to use the sticks to fight as a man, how to be a man who could look after the cattle of your father. I remember when I was staying in my uncle's place for some time, the bigger mother was the first wife of my father, Umangwa, coming to fetch me and my younger brother. And the story was, when I was saying, look, I was about to go to school, I want to go, I said, hey, who's going to look after the cattle of your father? Yours is to look after the cattle. Forget about school. Forget about school. It was not an issue then. And that's what happened. I went into looking after cattle until, from my childhood until I finished in terms of the age, when I was 16, 17 or so, or 18, you begin to go to work. But what I used to do, because my mother was a domestic worker in Durban, I used to visit her at times, and therefore got to know things in the big city. But also, I could have little jobs, garden, etc., to augment my mother's salary, because it were many, and then it was not going to be possible. And then have some other little small work and go back to when there's particularly summertime. And indeed, I grew up and became a man. I did still fight. I became almost average or a little bit above average. I understood it very well. And therefore, I was taught how to grow up to be a man, how to grow up with discipline and every other thing. So that was my life. And then, of course, the time came that I came to what school. But what I did, because there was no schooling, I organized a night school. Yes, at the time, from a cousin of ours who had gone to school. The school there was ending at standard 4. So she was our teacher. That's when I started going to school, and many young people, after I talked to her, she agreed. Many young people joined me. We had a night school which even had different kind of classes. She would be doing first year, second year, standard 1, standard 2, standard 3. But it was mainly to know Zulu and a bit of English, which then I developed later. But I was very proud, because once my mother, the big mother, had said no to school, when I proposed that the cousin of mine, which she knew, was ready to help, but he needed to be paid, and the money each child paid was 2 and 6, which is today we can call it 25 cents per month. And that helped us to have the basics. And from there I never looked back, because I developed many ways of educating myself, and that's how I made my young age and grew and grew. And when I went to of course, when I was now working in Durban, a young worker, we had political classes. We included a little bit of educational classes, even then. And each time I was trying to improve my education, my English, Zulu, I was done with it. I knew Zulu inside out. I continued to further my studies when I was in Robbenary. I did not start there. I started in my rural area. So I was doing what I had been doing all the time. And this is how the young man Jacob Zuma grew.
Oh, wow. Wow, that's so... I honestly have no words. Honestly, I know I wouldn't be able to also teach myself and learn so, like, in such a difficult environment, so much stuff. Wow. Because you're so well educated, and yeah, it's very, very inspiring.